Richard Nixon has one of the most remarkable American stories ever told. A real-life Shakespearean tragedy where a great man goes against the odds and rises above the circumstances of his birth, reaching the heights of power in society only to fall victim to the same tendencies that got him there in the first place. He was in many ways a brilliant man, but one who couldn't see past the suffering and ridicule of his early life. A rags to riches story of resilience and fortitude that culminated in its protagonist being written in the history books as one of the great cartoon villains. I think that Richard Nixon is one of the most fascinating human beings that's ever walked this earth. And I've spent hours and hours reading and watching his interviews, trying to understand him. And the more that I've learned, the more I feel we need to look towards his youth. In this video, I want to take a look back at Nixon's early life, the struggle, the loss, and the triumph that shaped this peculiar man. The grocer's boy turned leader of the free world, who ultimately fell victim to his own personal demons and paranoia.
President Richard Nixon, only months after landslide re-election, finds himself haunted by a question that will not go away.
I was born in a house my father built. Those are the opening words of Richard Nixon's memoirs, and what powerful words they are. More akin to literature and legend than simple autobiography. A turn-of-the-century version of Lincoln's Log Cabin. It tells you everything Nixon wants you to know about him, the mythology behind this larger-than-life man. When telling the tale of Richard Nixon, you can forgive yourself for catching a gleam of destiny. The white clapboard house, built by Frank Nixon over a century ago, still stands today, surrounded by the decadence and prestige of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. Who would have thought? Dick Nixon, the poor little grocer's boy, President of the United States. That house is a great allegory for Nixon himself, forged in poverty with a strong foundation, later surrounded by all the honors and prestige of the American presidency, yet still the same at its core. Frank Nixon built that house on land he intended to turn into a lemon grove, but the soil and the climate wasn't right for it. Later in life, Nixon would describe his parents as polar opposites. His father was a loud, boisterous, short-tempered man, while his mother was a true Quaker, calm, measured, and intelligent. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born on January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California. Nixon would reflect on his childhood as one of mainly economic strain, with a stable home life and two good parents, which wasn't the reality. Frank Nixon was a deeply angry man who failed at almost everything he ever pursued. His anger created greater hardship for his young son than their perilous financial situation ever could. Nixon's need to erase painful parts of his own personal story are reflective of deep-seated aspects of his character. Looking at Hannah Nixon, you can see many of the same features that would later be mocked and exaggerated by countless cartoonists after her son's monumental rise and fall. The dark, heavy eyebrows and the button nose that curves upwards. Hannah was a devoted mother, but not a very warm one.
My mother, as a matter of fact, taught me to read before I ever went to school. And as a result, I skipped one of the early grades, I think the second grade. And also, she influenced me greatly in the whole area of music because she could play the piano. She wasn't, of course, accomplished like my Aunt Jane or my Uncle Griffith. She was not a teacher, but her influence in those early years was enormous in that respect.
The young Nixon strived for success, excelling both academically and musically. As a child, he learned to play music and recite beautiful poems. He had little talent on the football field, but he was a fighter, and his difficulties in the sport only made him more dedicated to succeeding on the field. One of the most revealing relics of Nixon's early life is a letter he wrote at age 10 from the perspective of himself as a dog. "My dear master, the two boys that you left with me are very bad to me. Their dog Jim is very old and he will never talk or play with me. One Saturday, the boys went hunting. Jim and myself went with them. While going through the woods, one of the boys tripped and fell on me. I lost my temper and bit him. He kicked me in the side and we started on. While we were walking, I saw a black round thing in a tree. I hit it with my paw. A swarm of black thing came out of it. I felt pain all over. I started to run, and as both my eyes were swelled shut, I fell into a pond. When I got home, I was very sore. I wish you would come home right now. Your good dog, Richard. In this letter, a disgruntled young boy paints himself as the left-behind victim of a deeply cruel world. A parallel to this incident can be found in Nixon's courting of his future wife, Pat Ryan, where he would drive her to dates with other men and pick her up afterwards, just so she would keep him around. Hannah named all 5 of her boys after English kings. When Nixon was 12, his younger brother Arthur, the baby of the family, passed away after a short battle with meningitis at only 7 years old. Nixon would eulogize his younger brother in a beautiful essay he wrote in school.
Well, it isn't great literature, but perhaps it indicates how that particular event affected all of us. I was describing him. I remember how his eyes changed from their original baby blue to an almost black shade, and how his hair, blonde at first, became dark brown, and how his mouth, toothless for 5 months, was filled with tiny white teeth, which, by the way, were exceedingly sharp when applied on soft fingers or toes which happened to get within their reach, and how those little coherent, incoherent sounds of his finally developed into words and then into sentences, how he learned to roll over and then to crawl and finally to walk. Although I do not remember many incidents connected with my brother's early childhood, there were some which made a clear imprint on my mind. There was one time when he was asked to be a ring bearer at a wedding. I remember how my mother had to work with him for hours to get him to do it because he disliked walking with a little flower girl. Another time when he's about 5 years old, he showed the world that he was a man by getting some cigarettes out of our store and secretly smoking them back of the house. Unfortunately for him, one of our gossipy neighbors happened to see him, and she promptly informed my mother. I have disliked that neighbor from that time. And again, I shall never forget how he disliked wearing sticky, woolly suits. As soon as he was able to read, he used to search the mail order catalogs for suits which weren't sticky. There's a grave now out in the hills, but like the picture, it contains only the bodily image of my brother. And so when I'm tired and worried and I'm almost ready to quit trying to live as I should, I look up, I see the picture of a little boy with sparkling eyes and curly hair. I remember the childlike prayer. I pray that it may prove true for me as I did for my brother Arthur.
Harold, the oldest of the Nixon brothers, would suffer various health problems attributed to tuberculosis throughout his time in high school. Him and Hannah moved out to a special care facility in Arizona where he could receive better medical attention, and where Hannah worked treating other patients to pay the bills. Though he fought for a long time, Harold Nixon would ultimately succumb to his disease in 1933, at only 23 years old. Nixon dismisses psychohistorical analyses of his personality, which often delve into his childhood, as we're doing in this video. But the loss of 2 brothers to tuberculosis and the absence of the mother who was caring for them is sure to have had an effect. Hannah Nixon would say about her boy, "Richard always seemed to need me more than the 4 other sons did." In his final speech to his White House staff prior to his resignation, Nixon, at his most vulnerable, reflects on his parents in a Shakespearean scene.
Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die, and when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her. But she was a saint.
This man who came from nothing and achieved everything only to lose it, there at his most emotional moment. Rarely do you see such vulnerability in a leader, let alone a president. The studious Nixon placed third in his high school class, even earning a scholarship to Harvard. This could have been it. Nixon's ticket to success, away into the Eastern establishment he would later resent so deeply. But his family's precarious financial situation meant that Nixon couldn't leave home. They needed him to stay and help out at the store. Nixon had to attend the same small Quaker school that his mother had started at, Whittier College. Here, Nixon kept up his relentless pace, taking part in student government, debate, theater, football, and even the Glee Club. The college Nixon grew more self-assured, but he couldn't let go of the spiteful nature that drove him. It was the height of the Great Depression, and many Whittier students, including Nixon, were struggling with their finances. There were those on campus that looked down on the grocer's boy, who rose at 3:30 in the morning to drive to Los Angeles to buy produce for the Nixon market before heading off to class, and who would not relent in football no matter how often his lack of natural ability led to him falling to the ground, before stubbornly rising again for yet another game. Many of those who scoffed at Nixon were part of an exclusive club known as the Franklins. These were the campus elite, unburdened by the harsh financial situation many of their classmates had to endure. In response, Nixon helped organize a rival club, known as the Orthogonians, an odd collection of students that even accepted African American members. In contrast to the Franklins, whose yearbook photo attire consisted of elegant tuxedos, the Orthogonians wore open collared shirts to cast themselves as the everyday working men, aligning perfectly with young Richard's self-conception. It was through the Orthogonians that Nixon was able to find a place in campus politics. He defended their interests and led a movement to permit dancing at the old-fashioned Quaker college, despite being no fan of it himself. When Nixon received a scholarship to Duke University Law School, that was his ticket out of poverty. The fruits of his labor, the result of hours and hours of hard, honest work. He had risen above the squalor of his youth, but he didn't revel in this accomplishment. Nixon arrived at law school with the same isolated focus, poring over his books and his studies as though in an active battle, where his position could be ripped away from him at any moment. No matter what Nixon achieved as a young man, it was never quite enough to satisfy him. He always strove for more. Nixon was a painfully awkward young man, a trait he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Nixon himself admitted he was an introvert in an extrovert profession. Though just as Nixon may have had a natural disadvantage in politics as he had in sports, he overcame it with grit and dedication. When in public, he never seemed at ease. His gestures, his mannerisms, so awkward and mechanical. Early in life, Nixon developed a conception of himself as a have-not, someone who had to get their hands dirty and fight for a piece of the pie, directly opposed to the haves, who didn't have much to strive for, and as Nixon would say, just sat on their fat butts. He never quite let go of this conception. No matter what heights he reached, he would always think of himself as the underdog. If good things come easy to someone, are they any less deserving of it? Is the merit of an accomplishment based on the accomplishment itself or the effort taken to achieve it? One could read Nixon's pattern of self-destructive tendencies, as seen most famously through Watergate, as a way in which to confirm his persecution, that they were really out to get him. What starts the process are the laughs and snubs and slights that you get when you are a kid. But if you are reasonably intelligent, and if your anger is deep enough and strong enough, you learn that you can change those attitudes by excellence, personal gut performance, while those who have everything are sitting on their fat butts. There is a shockingly honest admission in that statement. If you are reasonably intelligent, and if your anger is deep enough and strong enough, you can change those attitudes. In no other circumstance have I ever seen an American president so clearly lay out their own personal motivations as being driven by hate and resentment, as though all of Nixon's many remarkable accomplishments were just a response to feeling inadequate, to being derided in his youth by those around him. This self-conception Nixon had of being the underdog, of always being under scrutiny, was a very powerful thing. You see him work best in adversarial situations. The man himself will tell you that. Nixon projected his low sense of self-worth onto others, almost as a way to overcome it. If he could show others he was the great man he aspired to be, maybe he himself would believe it. In his farewell address to the White House staff, you can see Nixon himself reflect on this attitude with seemingly deep regret.
Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
Nixon, in fact, had destroyed himself, had overcome insurmountable odds, had achieved everything he ever set out to do, all while living in fear and paranoia that the press, the elites, the liberals were out to get the poor grocer's boy from Whittier, a paranoia that ironically posed a greater threat to him than the institutions he so feared ever could. It's so easy to see Nixon at the end of his life as a remarkably brilliant man who let his own feelings of inadequacy and bitter resentment destroy him, though I would argue that it was those same feelings that drove him to achieve the heights that he did.
It is my sad duty to report to the people of the United States that Richard M. Nixon, who served as our 37th president, died this evening in New York City at 9:08 p.m. with his family at his side.
When Nixon died, his funeral was held there, at the little house that his father built, the grounds of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, built upon the same land that Frank Nixon made the mistake of buying. The former leader of the free world, buried there in that land that may have failed to grow lemons, but succeeded in growing a president of the United States.
Because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.